Good afternoon, dear viewers. Today, we have a continuation of the previously raised topic of the relay race of civilizations. Today, we will talk about another, so to speak, aspect of the sociogenesis of civilizations. If we previously considered civilizations as separate entities, as separate in the forest, let's say the animals that collide with each other live there, and we looked at what kind of animals live in the forest there. Bears, wolves, hares, and so on, then now we will see how each of them of these civilizations, it develops, how it is born, how it lives, and how it dies. In other words, we will look at civilization as a living organism. It is this topic that our second part is devoted to. So, the sociogenesis of local scientific civilizations. The growth and transformation of civilization is the first aspect. In other words, every civilization is born, goes through the stage of childhood, adolescence, and so on, and so on, and so on, and then it dies. At the same time, it gets different names. We talked about this a little bit at the last meeting. In particular, two examples. The ancient civilization began with the Crete-Mycenaean civilization. Then it became the ancient Greek civilization. Then this Roman Empire. Then the Byzantine Empire. It's all one ancient civilization, in fact, despite the fact that there were different phases. Russian civilization, from my point of view, is Kievan Rus, Muscovy, the Russian state, the Russian Empire, the USSR, Rifia. Then we stand on the threshold of the Eurasian community, the next final of the planetary and space civilization. In other words, every civilization goes through such phases of development. Why is she going through this? But we will consider this later. That's what other researchers are talking about. In particular, Toynbee speaks about this. Here is his scheme: birth, growth, flourishing, fracture, decomposition, death of civilization. This is according to Toynbee. Here is according to the scheme according to Gamilev. This is the ascent, the acmatic phase, the fracture, the inertial part, the obturation, the memorial part. The memorial is clear. In other words, there are some monuments and some population that no longer plays any role in the development of mankind. In other words, each of them, Gumilev, that one, Spengler, and all the others, have the idea that civilization is some living organisms that are born, develop, and end their lives, die. So, let's give examples. Here, please, is a map of Crete of the Mycenaean world. Look carefully. It's all around the island of Crete. The next step is much more. It is the same ancient civilization around the Aegean Sea. The next step is the Roman Empire on a much larger scale around the Mediterranean Sea. But it was the apotheosis, and then there was a compression to the Byzantine Empire, until the Byzantine Empire was eaten by the Turks, as you see in this picture. Well, this is exactly the topic. I have it. I'm going to explain how and why, on what basis. And that's why I created my own version of the theory, which I called the theories of local scientific civilizations. What is the difference? I'm going to tell you the background now. There is such a book, The History of Natural Science in Dates, published in the 70s, in my opinion, or in the 80s. Yakov Folt and Czechoslovakian researchers, in my opinion, who compiled a chronology of all scientific events in the entire history of human civilization. All scientific events in the entire history of civilization. In a small book, one phrase or one paragraph is dedicated to each scientific event, no more than that. Well, let's say there is the discovery of nuclear energy, one paragraph, the invention of the bow, one paragraph. There's a date and a place, a binding, right. The opening of a university, let's say so-and-so, one paragraph. The creation of the Copernican theory is one line. The creation of Newton's theory is one line. I see, right. This book, and it says the date and place. When I just began to systematize it, it turned out that it could be decomposed into such a matrix table. On the upper part, we have time running. It all started 3,000 years before our era, 5,000 years ago. First of all, it is predicted ahead, but we will not consider the forecast. And automatically, as it happened, I singled out 3 areas in the world. These are Eastern cultures, Western cultures, and Middle cultures. I'll tell you later. Well, the Middle cultures include ancient Greece, ancient antiquity, and the Slavs. us. China, India, the Arabs belong to the east. The Sumerians, ancient Egypt, and Western Europe belong to the west. Usually ancient Egypt and the Sumerians are at least considered Eastern civilizations, but this is wrong from my point of view. I will explain why later. And when all these events are here, look, the numbers here are 900 events, 22 events, 4 events, 29 events. In other words, I translated this whole book into events and numbers, and put these numbers into these cells, like in Lotto. And what did I get? When I translated the histograms, I got the following picture. Here is Western culture, here is the Middle culture. In the center of Eastern culture, we see that here we have Egypt, 4 phases of development. Then nothing happens here. There are middle cultures, antiquity. Everything happened here a little earlier on the Eastern Front. Right now, Western civilization is on the rise, and Russian civilization is on the rise, in fact, on the rise too. That is, I'm not going to tell you why now, because these details are not interesting. I just want to show that on the basis of these histograms, I have compiled a primitive 4-stage scheme for each civilization. In other words, every civilization, from my point of view, passes lives for 2,000 years. This is an average, this is a round figure. It has been 2,158 years. It has absolutely no meaning. The average age of a person living is 70 years, for example. Someone dies 30, someone dies in 100 years, and on average 70. Here is the average age of life of a civilization on a scientific one, 2,000 years. 4 clearly distinguished phases of 500 years. The first phase is the preparation of a unified information platform. The second phase is 500 years of mastering the world heritage. This is apprenticeship, that is, it is the absorption of previously accumulated knowledge. The third, most interesting phase for 500 years is the creation of one's own worldview and a new scientific paradigm. This is what this civilization lives for. In other words, it raises the entire world community a step higher in this third phase. Then it all ends abruptly and, for example, in ancient Rome, no one traces a single scientific discovery. Compared to ancient Greece, it is a scientific desert, ancient Rome. Although there were, of course, developed technologies, but the technologies there were mainly based on the achievements made by the ancient Greeks. This is Western civilization. Why is this important? It has now passed the third phase from the Renaissance to the 1970s, and many note that some fundamental scientific discoveries stopped in the 70s. Everything has moved into technological development. In other words, old theories, fundamental things, they are now turning into technologies. The last phase is 500 years old, when a civilization that has accumulated this technological power begins to spread it all around the world, which is accessible to it. But we saw at a previous meeting that the Roman Empire, it was only available to a certain region, for example, yes. With modern Western civilization, the whole planet is available, so the whole planet will now be filled with these technological innovations. It is already being filled almost, which was created by Western civilization. In other words, the world in which we now live is a merit of Western civilization. None, of course, at the Western price in the basis of Western civilization. And the fourth phase is the phase of the world empire. There are colonial empires, and there are world empires. Here it is very clearly necessary to understand this difference. Here, if we depict the same thing in such a soft form, then here we have such a curve that reaches a maximum of 1,250 years after birth. There are these fat black dots here. These are the phases of transition from one stage to another, which is characterized by very serious cataclysms, social upheavals, and so on. And the more serious the transition, the more of these cataclysms and shocks. Each of these stages is dominated by one or another public priority. At the first 500-year stage, religion dominates, which then gives way to philosophy at the second stage. That is, it becomes the leader of the development of philosophy. At the third stage, science always dominates, philosophies and religions are relegated to secondary roles. And the fourth stage is dominated by politics. This I have traced through all civilizations. This is a separate topic. You can trash it and discuss it and so on as much as you like. 2,000 years, but 2,000 years, and the previous phase of preparation is about 1,000 years. Well, for example, we have the first ancient Egyptian civilization appeared 5,000 years ago, when the Upper and Lower Nile united as one state, and the chronology began. The chronicle started when these pharaonic dynasties went to be recorded. It was there 5,000 years ago, and before that, 1,000 years ago, that is, 4,000 years before our era, 3,000 years before ours. Nomes arose and developed, that is, these are separate areas along the Nile, each of which, having developed, began to unite again by force. That is, thousands of years of preparation, 2,000 years of full-fledged life, and after that, old age of thousands of years of living out in the form of an aging civilization. A striking example of an aging civilization is Byzantium. It lived from the 1,500th year after the collapse of Rome to the 1,500th year, exactly 1,000 years in the 1,500th year, conditionally in the 1,515th century. It ended its existence under the onslaught of Islam, and the West as well. That's the picture, yes. And moreover, the state forms are changing. At the first stage, it is basically a nation-state for 500 years. For us, let's say that Russia is there at the second stage. It is a multinational empire state. Let's say the Russian Empire at the second stage of the 500-year-old. On the third, it is always a colonial system. The colonial system in the third stage is a very good thing. Why? Because thanks to these colonies, the achievement of scientific civilization is spreading all over the world. All civilizations had a colonial period. In the ancient civilization, in the Egyptian civilization, he recently completed the second stage of Western civilization, the third stage. And the last phase is the world empire. This differs from the colonial empire by a much greater rigidity of management, the obligation of this management. That is, if a colony is some kind of separate centers for collecting tribute there, collecting resources, and spreading culture, then the world empire is already a complete cover. Full cover, full submission, right? Well, take the Roman Empire, let's say. It was clear there. It was a world empire in which Roman law operated throughout the Roman Empire. And try to say something there, yes. Here, the Jewish people died in the 70s, completely destroyed the entire state, destroyed Jerusalem, the temple, scattered all the Jews. They marched against the empire. It didn't count for them. Another aspect is that I get asked questions all the time, as you defined, Sergei Ivanovich, the moment of the birth of every civilization. Well, I have to say that it was a very difficult task, but in the end I found it. There are always 6 events that characterize the moment of birth. But the moment of birth itself is about 250 years long. Well, 250 years, 150 years. That is, birth lasts a long time. That is, childbirth does not happen quickly. The very first thing is the creation of a written word. The second is the creation of a written fundamental work. It is, for example, there is a Bible or a translation of the Bible, or, let's say, the Book of the Dead in ancient Egypt, or, let's say, the Mahabharata in India, or the Book of Changes, which remain fundamental works for the entire history of further civilization. The next, third stage is baptism. It is the acceptance of a single faith throughout the territory. Here is with the baptism of Russia, but few people know that there was a baptism of Europe, because Europe was 500 years before the baptism of Russia and pagan, and there were priests who carried this Catholic faith. At the fourth stage, it is the creation of a right. Let's say Yaroslav the Wise, who created the truth, wrote, "Other civilizations have created the same truth." In other words, these are uniform legal laws. And the last event before the beginning of the chronology. We have this chronicle. If we look, let's say, at the time axis, how these events are spaced here in Russian civilization, the 863rd year, is Cyril, Methodius, who created writing. They simply modified our old Slavic script, made it different, more adapted to the world language. 875th year translation of the Bible into this language by Cyril Methodevsky. 882nd year baptism, the beginning of the baptism of Prince Vladimir. The fourth is this long period of creating a single political space. The struggle for the integrity of Russia ended with Yaroslav the Wise, who in 1980th year. But this, or rather, baptism began in 1980th year, but the unification went from 1882nd to 1036th year, when Yaroslav the Wise finally created a single Kievan Rus. Then this famous historical truth was adopted, which distributed, that is, a single legal standard for the entire territory. And so in the 1110th year, our famous chronographer, the historian, began to write where the Russian land came from and so on. The beginning of the chronicle. Nestor the chronicler. These are the events in time. We see 863rd year, 130 years, and 110, about 250 years last. If we look at whether this has happened, let's say, with Western civilization, the same thing. The writing was created by the famous monk Bulfila. In my opinion, the date is 370th year, 130 years before the conditional date of birth. The main book of Bulfil and Ironem is a translation into Latin of the Bible. The baptism of the Chlodevs was first conducted. He is just literally in the sense of how Vladimir did with Europe. He translated her Catholic faith. The unification, so to speak, was immediately carried out by Gez Clovis, so the right solo truth, the so-called, was the same socialist truth 500 years before the truth of Yaroslav the Wise. It was adopted just exactly in the 500th year. Chronology. Gregory of Tours. In the year 580, he began to write a chronology of this civilization. We have Nestor the chronicler 30 years later. Well, it is relatively clear that here is such a run-up. Here. And this is the same table for us. That's if we combine the event canvas of Russia. In Russia and Europe on the time axis, then we see the first event, the second, let's say, in Russia, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth. That's it for Russia. And for Europe, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. Well, it can be seen that there is a shift here, but the sequence is the same. And the events are obligatory, because if you want to create an integral state, and you don't have a single language, a single law, a single book that everyone worships, a single faith that everyone believes in, but you don't have a single chronology, then you will never create any integrity. It's perfectly obvious, yes. The next moment, the civilization of Russia is the next link in the relay race of civilization. In other words, we have already said that every civilization is born with a gap of 500 years, right here on this one. On this slide, we see that 3,000 years before our era, the Egyptian civilization was born, but again a conditional figure. After 500 years Mesopotamia, after 1,000 years antiquity, after 500 years China, India after 500 years. Here are a few omissions here, minus 2000th year, year zero, mysterious moments for me. European civilization was born in the 500th year after the fall of the Roman Empire, the final end of antiquity. Then the Russian civilization was born 500 years later as a civilization. I'm not talking about culture. The culture may be older, younger, it doesn't matter at all. The next civilization, according to Pipes and Huntington, I agree with them, is Latin America, which started in the 1500th year. Then we are Europeans, and perhaps it will be an African civilization that can only be born now. Ma knows him. The foggy forecast area is already beginning here. So it turns out from this scheme that the Russian civilization is 500 years younger than the European civilization. And we have all the events shifted 500 years later. Well, not really for 500, because the pressure is powerful and events have been happening, therefore 300 years, for 200 years. But many people say to me, well, how is this so? We have an ancient culture, and you let us down. It turns out that we are younger than Europe. How is that so? This, I say, guys, younger doesn't mean worse. Well, what's there to prove? Well, we are younger, yes. But we will go further. We will take the next step. Well, what's wrong with that? That we are younger as a civilization. We just have such a stage. The next one is to create a planetary space civilization. Thank you, European civilization, which has prepared a platform for us, the industrial world. We will go to the next stage on the basis of this industrial world. At the same time, our culture is actually, according to Koltsev's research, well, there is at least 5,000 years. Or even 9,000 years older than the European one. That is, we have the origin there dated back 24,000 years, here somewhere in Siberia. And the European R1 be 17,000 years ago. Here we are older, and here we are younger. That is, in fact, it is not necessary to understand how older or younger, how bad or good. And look for this ancient mouth. There are some roots there. Often ancient genera are already degenerates. Unfortunately, there is also such a phenomenon. Therefore, we should not be ashamed of our youth. We should rejoice in it. And there are still many big things ahead of us. What special can be said about the universal tasks that stand? I have already given the scheme of the Toffler. I have redrawn it here a little. Made it a little more beautiful. Here, what is it about? The evolution of mankind, from my point of view, has gone through only three major stages. This is the biosphere stage, the agricultural sphere, and the technosphere. The fourth step is waiting for us ahead, access to the cosmosphere. What is it about? The biosphere stage is appropriation, it is hunting and gathering. Agricultural stage. This is agriculture and cattle breeding. The industrial stage is the resources for creating an industry. The fourth stage, and Toffler, I fully agree with him, cannot be a development of the third stage of the technosphere. Of course, the technosphere, pulling up the agricultural sphere, is obviously pulling up the biosphere stage. Why? Because with the help of technical means, the collection of fish, that is, fishing, has become more advanced, satellite intelligence, networks and other things, right. This does not mean that there is a denial. In other words, this cosmospheric stage that awaits us ahead is not a denial of the technosphere stage, it is its development. Tightening, improvement, optimization, harmonization, but all the same, we must enter the cosmosphere, the infosphere, and create a completely new stage of development of all mankind. At the same time, Russia, as we see, is, since it started 500 years later, it is. Each civilization raises the power of the human world to the next stage. I see, right? In other words, it is clear that the European civilization is more powerful than, let's say, the Indian ancient civilization, and the ancient Chinese civilization, and even more powerful than the ancient civilization. Why? Because the energy density of energy coming to one member of this civilization is much greater. In other words, we are much more energetically equipped, at least on this basis. Therefore, the next stage is whether it will be Russia, or there will be no Russia, anyone. But anyway, in any case, it will be a level higher on the order than the modern level. It's just logic suggests. Well, as a product of Russian civilization, as a patriot of Russian civilization, I am not only confident and knowing that Russia is capable of creating a completely new sum of technologies, bringing humanity to a new energy level, bringing it to a new harmonic way and transformation, which we are constantly talking about. That is, we have a Preobrazhensky club. We are going to transform the whole world based on our culture and everything else. Thank you for your attention. I'm done with that. Any questions? Absolutely. This is very good. I like questions. All right. Well, I have the following questions. You have said, and I absolutely agree with you, that civilization is some kind of global organisms that are born, pass through youth, maturity, old age, and die. Question, why are they born? Gumilev, as the reason for the appearance of ethnogenesis, well, as if attracted physical reasons. These are cosmic rays, mutations, and so on and so on. You know, you can disagree, but he really had a problem from what suddenly, out of the blue, there are active ethnic groups that begin to expand. I understand your question. What's yours? My version is like this. I understand that my version, it does not stand up to any classical scientific criticism, but I will express it anyway, because I think so, I can't think otherwise. From my point of view, there is an information field of the universe in which there is a pre-planned plan for the construction, creation of humanity. It's like we're building a building, let's say, right? We have an album, and this album has the foundation, the first floor, the second floor, the third. We leaf through the album, and everything is already pre-planned there. Exactly the same plan exists in heaven in this energy informational plane. And when the time comes, energy, information, and the necessary personalities descend from this plane, and a new stage begins. Everything is written there. We are just implementing it. We were walking with a builder at a construction site. In other words, you don't want to explain, and you say that this is some kind of external source of this beginning. The idea, external, the idea. And then here's the second question I had. Then, in fact, it is also being removed. I had a question, why in 500 years? I can tell you the answers right away, because that's the plan. No. And why every 500 years? That's how you claim. So, well, let's just ask you a counter question. Why does the sun rise and set every 24 hours? I have my own version. I am ready to present it in the next program. Why does a generation change every 20 years? That's me too. Because, the answer is because this is an actual, so to speak, eventful thing, which I do not undertake to explain. Well, the answer is clear. The sun rises and